The free and diverse press is the backbone of our vibrant democracy. As Justice Louis Brandeis wrote in 1927, those who want our independence believe that public discussion is a political duty, that the greatest threat to freedom is an uninformed citizenry, and that the freedom of thought and speech are indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. But over the past decade, the news industry has been in a state of economic freefall. From 2006 to 2017, advertising revenue has fallen from $49 billion to $15.6 billion, resulting in mass layoffs or newspapers folding altogether. This year alone, roughly 2,900 reporters and other news staff have already lost their jobs. These massive cuts are happening to traditional news companies and online news sources alike. For example, earlier this year, the Cleveland Plain Dealer announced another round of layoffs due to advertising losses, reducing its staff by 80% from employment levels just 7 years ago. BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post have also announced significant layoffs. These are online publishers that have never relied on revenue from classified sections or subscriptions and are designed to appeal to readers on social media sites and mobile devices. This raises a critical question. If online news publishers can't survive, then who can? During the same period, online platforms that are gateways to news online have operated with virtual immunity from the antitrust laws. Since 2007, Google has acquired several of its competitors in the online advertising market, resulting in significant concentration and a complete lack of transparency in this market. And since 2011, another dominant online platform, Facebook, has acquired two of its rivals, Instagram and WhatsApp, in an effort to corner the market for social media services and advertising on these services. Facebook now controls a user base of 2.7 billion people worldwide, the largest communications platform in human history. It soon plans to combine its products into a single platform, a move critics have suggested Facebook is making to thwart antitrust enforcement. As Australia's Competition Authority noted in its preliminary report on digital platforms, both Google and Facebook have substantial market power in a number of markets that is unlikely to erode over time through new competitive threats. There have also been numerous reports of these platforms engaging in anti-competitive conduct, such as favoring their own products or discriminating against rivals, that has gone unchecked by Congress and unchallenged by antitrust enforcers in the United States. These trends strongly suggest that the decline of the news industry is not the inevitable result of the arrival of the internet, but is instead a direct consequence of enforcement choices that have created a market structure where a small number of platforms are capturing the value created by journalists and publishers. This has affected news publishers in two key ways. First, news publishers rely on Google and Facebook for the vast majority of traffic online. Even minor changes to the platform's algorithms can have significant effects on the news industry overall. Furthermore, as a result of this immense concentration of economic power, news publishers and local news in particular have little bargaining power with the online platforms, exacerbating the economic crisis for trustworthy news. Second, these platforms have a dominant position in the advertising market. Last year, Facebook and Google amassed more than $60 billion from online advertising, the majority of all online ad revenue, while controlling 90% of the growth in this market. As David Treverne, the president of the News Media Alliance, who will testify today, this dynamic has resulted in an economic catastrophe for news publishers, forcing them to cut back on their investments in quality journalism. In response, I've introduced the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act with Ranking Member Collins to give news publishers an even playing field to collectively negotiate with dominant platforms to improve the quality, accuracy, attribution, and interoperability of news online. While I do not view this legislation as a substitute for more meaningful competition online or antitrust scrutiny, it is clear that we must do something in the short term to save trustworthy journalism before it's lost forever. This bill is a life support measure, not the remedy for long-term health. Whether it's an online publisher or local newspapers, we cannot have a democracy without a free and diverse press. Our country will not survive if we do not have shared facts, if corruption is not exposed and rooted out at all levels of government, and if power is not held to account. This is the very reason the press is called the Fourth Estate.
Over the course of the last 200 years, Congress has routinely passed laws to protect and advance a free and diverse press. Whenever new technologies have transformed how Americans produce and share news, be it the telegraph, the radio, the telephone, or broadcast television, Congress has sought to ensure that these new markets were structured to facilitate the free flow of information and to protect the independence and financial viability of the press. Today, as the internet becomes the dominant platform for accessing news, and as this platform grows more and more concentrated in the hands of just two major companies, The news media once again face serious threats, and congressional action once again may be required. As avenues for accessing news have narrowed in recent years, advertising revenue, which is the primary means of support for most news publishers, has steadily declined as well. And as revenue has fallen, so too has the number of journalists whose work can be supported by news publications. Local news outlets have been the most severely affected by this trend, with nearly 2,000 local news publishers ceasing operations since 2007. In fact, the majority of counties in the United States no longer have a publisher of local news at all. Hundreds of other publishers have been forced to consolidate or shrink their operations. This journalism crisis is also a democracy crisis. As sources of trustworthy news disappear, American civic life suffers. The majority of local newspapers and television stations no longer even assign a reporter to cover state and local government matters. With a less informed citizenry, communities without quality local news generally see lower rates of voter turnout. And cities where newspapers shut down have even seen their borrowing costs rise, suggesting, according to one study, that diminished transparency may enable governments to engage in riskier and more inefficient, or perhaps more corrupt, financing arrangements. While there are a number of causes of this multi-decade decline in the news industry, including reduced print circulation and reduced revenue from classified advertisements, one of the major concerns that has emerged in recent years is the power of a small number of gatekeepers over the news and information that citizens see. Today, the vast majority of Americans consume their news online, and two online platforms have immense control over how Americans access their news sources. A single algorithm change by one of these private corporations can entirely distort what information the public shares and consumes and what revenue the publisher receives. Moreover, these same platforms dominate the online advertising market, and they account for nearly all of the growth in this market in recent years. No single factor has led to this immense concentration of control, but it is incumbent on Congress to understand the sources of this problem and to address it urgently. The American tradition has long recognized that preserving an open marketplace of ideas is vital to safeguarding the First Amendment and vital to a democratic form of government.
I'm excited to have joined Subcommittee Chairman Cicilline in the introduction of the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. This bill takes head-on the problem of local and other news organizations disappearing from the public square as news consumption moves increasingly online. A vibrant press has been critical to the success of our democracy since the founding of the Republic. In the old days, press organizations were able to thrive based on their subscription and advertising revenues. But as the news consumption has moved to the internet, traditional subscriptions are speedily drying up, and online advertising revenues are increasingly becoming dominated by online platforms. As a result, news organizations across the country are rapidly losing their economic lifeblood and disappearing from the public square. If individual news outlets could count on being able to negotiate fair attribution and advertising revenue agreements with the online platforms, the bleeding could be stopped. The problem, however, is that smaller news organizations don't stand a fair negotiating chance when they try to negotiate deals with the platform giants. These giants stand as a bottleneck, a classic antitrust problem, but between consumers and the producers of news content. Journalism Competition and Preservation Act seeks to solve this problem simply by allowing news publications to take the platform's bottleneck together. Specifically, the bill allows the publications 4 years in which they can collectively negotiate with the platforms without fearing antitrust enforcement against that activity. In other words, the bill allows news publications to take on an antitrust problem without worrying that their antitrust laws themselves will stand in the way. It does not propose any new regulatory structures. It does not threaten to break up any company. It does promise to simply and effectively solve the problem.
My name is David Chavrin, and I'm the President and CEO of the News Media Alliance, a nonprofit trade association representing over 2,000 publishers across the United States. Our members include some of the largest news organizations covering events around the globe, as well as local publishers focusing on the issues that impact communities and the daily lives of citizens in every state and congressional district. The news media has played a key role in our democracy since its founding. The mission has been to enrich society's understanding and foster public discourse that is vital to a healthy democracy. And over the years, the news media has fulfilled that mission extremely well. We are also an industry that has fully embraced a digital future. Publishers offer a wide array of innovative and compelling online experiences sustained by truly great journalism, and my membership includes a number of digital-only news publishers. But the rise of digital news distribution has also introduced new and potentially existential threats to the news industry, specifically the emergence of dominant tech platforms as intermediaries between publishers and their audiences. Online platforms serve an important purpose. Today, 93% of Americans get at least some of their news online. These platforms help users find great journalism, and in doing so, they've contributed to the enormous growth in news audiences over the past 2 decades. In the same way that digital platforms are critical for online news is critical for the digital platforms. The public demand for quality journalism is massive and growing, and that has driven deep engagement with Facebook and Google. A study we released yesterday estimates that news content generated some $4.7 billion for Google in 2018. The platforms and news organizations' mutual reliance would not be a problem if not for the fact that the concentration among the platforms means that a small number of companies now exercise an extreme level of control over the news. In effect, a couple of dominant firms act as regulators of the news industry. Only these regulators are not constrained by legislative or democratic oversight. The result has been to siphon revenue away from news publishers. This trend is clear if you compare the growth in Google's total advertising revenue to the decline in the news industry's ad revenue. In 2004, Google's U.S. revenue was $2.1 billion, while the newspaper industry accounted for $48 billion in advertising revenue. In 2017, in contrast, Google's U.S. revenue had increased over 25 times to $52.4 billion, while the newspaper industry's ad revenue had fallen 65% to $16.4 billion. The effect of this revenue decline on publishers has been terrible, and they've been forced to cut back on their investments in journalism. That is the reason why newsroom employment has fallen nearly a quarter over the last decade. One question might be asked is, if the platforms are on balance having such a negative impact on the news media, then why don't publishers do something about it? The answer is they cannot, at least under the existing antitrust laws. News publishers face a collective action problem. No publisher on its own can stand up to the tech giants. The risk of demotion or exclusion from the platforms is simply too great. And the antitrust laws prevent news organizations from acting collectively. So the result is that publishers are forced to accept whatever terms and restrictions are imposed on them. The Journalism, Competition, and Preservation Act, introduced by Chairman Cicilline and Ranking Member Collins, is an innovative, market-oriented solution to this collective action problem. Markets work best when both parties have some leverage to ask for better terms and to credibly withdraw from negotiations if the other side's demands are unreasonable. Our goal is actually to find a way to work sustainably with the online platforms to give Americans the best journalism possible. Present trends in the news business simply cannot continue. Without some action to give news publishers a voice in their future, we will all experience the effects of deep financial stress in this industry and the loss of great, important journalism in communities across the country. It is not too much to say that the very fabric of our civic society is at risk. And this is not a problem that will be solved by private charity from individuals or even the big platforms themselves. What we need are sustainable business relationships that return value to the great important journalists who create the news content on which we all depend.
I'm here today because the marketplace for news is broken. Healthy markets incentivize risk, investment, and effort by rewarding companies that develop superior products. Unfortunately, in the news business, free riding by dominant online platforms, which aggregate and then reserve our content, has led to the lion's share of online advertising dollars generated off the back of news going to the platforms. Many in Silicon Valley dismiss the press as old media, failing to evolve in the face of online competition, but this is wrong. We're not losing business to an innovator who has found a better or more efficient way to report and investigate the news. We're losing business because the dominant platforms deploy our news content to target our audiences, to then turn around and sell that audience to the same advertisers we're trying to serve. The erosion of advertising revenue undercuts our ability to invest in high-quality journalism. Meanwhile, the platforms have little, if any, commitment to accuracy or reliability. For them, a news article is valuable if viral, not if verified. news publishers need a fighting chance. The Journalism Competition and Preservation Act is well designed to help restore the proper balance between content generators and distributors on the internet. This bipartisan legislation is narrowly tailored both in scope and duration.
This kind of investigative reporting is hard. It's upsetting. It's important. It has real impact, and we are proud of it. But newspapers do other important stories too. We invested a lot of time, money, and effort in these stories I mentioned. That's what newspapers do. We use our resources to tell our community stories, the good ones and the hard ones. Telling them makes our community better. Almost always, the debate about media and tech is framed within a discussion of international news brands. But the greatest peril for our nation lurks at the local level, where a regional or community newspaper must cope with fast-changing technological and financial matters. We're the ones who are concerned with our communities, their government, and their well-being. Our staffs live in our community. They have a big stake in informing the public. Social media and technology companies have enormous influence on the distribution and availability of news. But we should be worried about losing newspapers, the fountainheads within the local news ecosystem. It is worth considering stories that would go untold.
How do the online giants control user data, and why is this such a powerful phenomenon?
Thank you, Congressman. The advertising has changed profoundly so that rather than reaching an audience, advertisers now reach individuals. And to the degree that they're able to get more and more detailed data about those individuals, they can send them targeted data. So the more data a company has, the more it can segment the market, the more it can deliver targeted ads. And the dominant platforms are light years ahead of other competitors in terms of the amount of their data, thus their dominance in the digital ad space.
Is how can we be sure that any agreement that the news publications negotiate with the online platforms under what we're proposing under this legislation will be adequate and flexible enough to endure for a long time in this quickly evolving market? I believe it's more than just right this minute. How does it play out 10, 15 years down the road?
Well, thank you, Representative. Obviously, there's never going to be guarantees about infinite solutions, but I think what there is a real chance for us to develop an enduring partnership with the platforms. Again, at the end of the day, the platforms, I view them as a solution, a potential solution for news and journalism rather than a problem. And I think the issues are well understood and pretty well defined. We have issues about revenue, we have issues about data, we have issues about algorithms and our brand. But these are all things that I think are solvable, achievable, and that I'm confident that we could develop a solution that would greatly support journalism for some significant period of time. I don't think this is one of those issues that's not solvable. I think it's imminently solvable.
Would you also agree that this is an issue that both parties really, in a lot of ways, need each other? That this is not really one upset at the other and the other upset at the, that there's not mutually exclusive positions here, that the online platforms need the local content spoken of by others, and at the same point in time, the online and the local also need, to have this, divergent technology, disruptive technologies that has been good in many, many ways. Do you see that as a symbiotic kind of relationship that should be instead of an adversarial relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are amazing, wonderful distribution platforms that, by the way, have allowed us to grow our digital audience larger than it's ever been, or in terms of any audience. And they need good content to engage their users, and we need access to those users. It's just that in this world where we can't act collectively, that means that we have this problem of any one publisher really doesn't get a say in how its content is distributed to those users.
One of the things.
Which online platforms would you say are most impacting the public's access to trustworthy sources of journalism, and why?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think in terms of disinformation, the platforms that are having the most impact are Facebook and YouTube. And that's because of their business models, which are to prioritize engagement, engaging content because of the human nature that, the survival instinct. We tend to tune into things that make us fearful or angry. And so by prioritizing engagement, these platforms are actually prioritizing disinformation as well. It serves their profit motives to keep people on the platforms as long as possible, to show them ads and collect their data. And because they don't have any competition, they're free to pursue these destructive business models without having any competitive constraint. They've also lacked regulation. Normally, corporations are not permitted to just pursue profits without regard to the consequences.
So let's.
Why should we enact the Journalist Competition Act as opposed to just enforcing antitrust law? And I'll just start with Mr. Chabert.
Well, thank you very much. The current antitrust laws protect Google and Facebook from us, interestingly, which is both wrong and ironic from our perspective. What we're suggesting is really what we view as the lightest touch option on the table in terms of giving us the power just to stand up for ourselves. And also, I have to note there's a real urgency in the industry currently. This is an industry that really can't wait years and years for antitrust solutions. We're at a crisis point now. And what we're asking for is relatively simple, relatively straightforward. We're not asking the government to regulate anyone or tax anyone. We're just really asking to be left alone to defend ourselves.
Thank you.
Mr. Chavern, we've talked about many newspaper publishers have seen significant growth in digital subscriptions, but yet they continue to struggle, and many have shut down, which is truly unfortunate. Would you please talk a little bit about why the news industry continues to struggle despite the increase in online readership and digital subscription?
Certainly, thank you. Again, the audience, our audience is both growing and moving very quickly to online spaces, and those spaces are dominated by just a few companies that take the vast bulk of the advertising revenue, determine everything about the experience you get with your news publisher. Again, I call them our regulators because they get to decide what news is delivered to who and when, how the news that's delivered to me is different than the news delivered to you, and whether we can monetize it and on what terms.
I think it's so important for everyone to hear your words on that topic. Please go ahead.
They are incredible and powerful advertising engines that do great targeted advertising, often around our content, and they take the bulk of the digital advertising revenue. So really the rules of the game for online engagement of news are set up against content creators, publishers. But again, one of the things we do know is that people love news. The audience is bigger than ever. It drives a lot of engagement, and certainly the platforms know this.
Interesting what we define as news these days, but please go ahead.
The platforms know this. They know that people go online to consume that product, and then they get to make money, monetize them to our detriment.
Thank you.
What are some of the ways that online platforms could help the AJC maintain that relationship with its readers and help readers know that they're getting information from a reliable source?
Well, I'm going to offer you a brief answer to that and then suggest Mr. Chavern jump in because he has spent a lot of time on this issue. But one of the things that's important to us as a media organization is that it is clear when users of any service come to our content that it's clear to them that it's from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and all that that means to people in terms of its accuracy, its fairness, and its how well presented that it is. And when it's confusing to anyone about the source of content, we do invite that idea of misinformation and people struggling to get to the truth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And would you like to add to that, please?
Sure. There's always been crazy conspiracy theories. They usually were delivered to us by a crazy uncle over the dining room table. And you knew that was different than what was in the newspaper and what was on TV. And the internet platforms, often all the indicators about brand are suppressed. And that's not only bad for my members in the publishing business, because we're in the trust business. It's bad for the public because they lose signals about where information is coming from. So brand suppression is a serious issue that that does need to be addressed with the platforms.
Thank you.
The second point I'd like to follow up on was regarding the ad revenue piece, because I just want to clarify for my own understanding in the record, and I missed the exchange regarding the 70-30 split. My understanding from your testimony is the example they're citing relates to Google. Does that same ratio apply to the other companies, or is that?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So Google has publicly stated that on a few occasions. The Karen Cross report that I identify cites revenue splits between other major internet services that are at 70 and above, depending on the particular product that's being used by different platforms. In some cases, it's 85 or even 100% of the revenue is retained by the news publisher. So it varies greatly by the platform. I know of no revenue split whereby the news publisher only receives 30%. I'm not saying there aren't some, but that these reports that are cited in
Sure, Mr. Shears, I just want to start with you. Google captures 88% of the U.S. online search market, 94% of all searches on smartphones, 78% of the search ad tech market, and 59% of the third-party display ad market. I take it you agree that these don't, at least on their face, appear to be competitive markets.
Which precise market are we talking about?
Well, let's start with searches on smartphones, 94% of the market, controlled by one platform. You would agree that's not competitive under any definition?
Well, I think I would say 94% of a relevant market would be something worthy of considering, but I think...
You think a mobile search ad market is not a relevant market?
I think the relevant market in that case would be what economists would tell us compete with that. And I know that searching on my phone in the browser, I can also search on my phone by asking Siri, I can search talking to the digital assistant smart speaker in my room. There are a lot of places that users today can go to get answers that extend beyond the browser search experience. And these are increasingly pageless tools that don't require a search engine. And so, I think economists might not agree that desktop search is a discrete market.
I don't actually know any economist who doesn't agree that that's not a competitive market. I guess I'm asking you. Do you agree that that's not a competitive market when it's operating at 94% of the market share?
I think 94% of the market share of a relevant market is something that merits consideration.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether that's a market.
International. But Ms. Hubbard, I'd ask you, the Press Gazette recently reported that a single algorithm change at Google resulted in Google-directed traffic to the Mail Online, that it caused it to fall by 50%. Nick Thompson, the editor of Wire, shared that a single tweak by Facebook led Facebook-based traffic to Wire to drop by 90%. How does this power dynamic, the fact that a platform can effectively shut off a publisher's traffic, affect the independence of the press and the ability of people to access trustworthy, reliable news?
Clearly it's a monopoly problem because no one company should have the ability to decide which publications can exist and which ones can't. And this ability to turn off basically the traffic to any publisher is hugely problematic from a democracy standpoint because it basically is a shield from criticism. A lot of journalists are not even going to have the courage to speak out and criticize big tech in the first place, knowing that this can be done.
Mr. Chervin, I just want to ask one final question. I think you made reference to the increasing number of people that obtain their news from digital services, record participation by subscription, lots of interest and engagement in news, so huge increase in consumer and in customer use of your product, but declining revenues. But I think Mr. Shears has sort of said that's just the way it is, that's just the market, that's just sort of the moment we're in. What's your response to that?
Present trends can't continue. If we continue on this path, we're going to lose vast amounts of quality journalism, particularly in communities all around the country. That's not just a bad business outcome, that is utterly destructive to our civic society and can't be allowed to happen. And what we've asked for is a chance for a different kind of future. And we need that future collectively.
Thank you, Mr. Chervin.